Alexander began to adopt Persian dress and customs, much to the disgust of the Greek generals that had served under his father. This older generation regarded the Persians as no more than barbarians. Alexander started to replace the old guard with his own men.
Gradually, the officers of Philip are being replaced by Alexander's men, people like Perdiccas, Ptolemy the future king, and above all, Hephaestion, Alexander's closest friend and almost certainly his lover. And by the end of 330, Alexander's officers are his own generation, people who owed everything to him.
Alexander's behavior was becoming erratic. The tough conditions, the hard campaign trail were taking their toll, and he was drinking heavily. Clitus, his savior, and one of his oldest friends, dared to criticize him at a drunken banquet.
One of the companions who was attending this dinner took Alexander's sword quietly away from him. I presume it had been lying on the couch beside him, and took the sword away because he could see what was about to happen. But in the course of this, when Clitus kept coming back and taunting him, he grabbed a spear from one of the servants and ran him through with a spear. The morning after the night before, he felt utter remorse. He was devastated at what he had done. Some say he tried to kill himself. He was so embarrassed and so incredulous that he had actually killed a man who had saved his life at the Battle of the Granicus, whose sister had been his nanny when he was a child. Others say he just went into his tent and wept for several days. But I think drink was certainly an impetus in this terrible, terrible episode.
But Alexander's lust for conquest was still not satisfied. At the age of 29, he passed under the shadow of the Himalayas and entered Bactria, present-day Afghanistan. Alexander was impressed by these exotic people and their customs. He met a beautiful Bactrian princess called Roxanne and was bewitched by her.
The sources say that she was really spectacularly beautiful, and Alexander saw her and fell in love with her at first sight and actually married her rather than taking her as a concubine or whatever. And this was his only official marriage. And of course it was to a woman who would have been classed as barbarian. She was not Greek, she was not Macedonian, she was a native of Asia, of Afghanistan. And it is, I think, fair to say that the Macedonian noblemen would not have expected to have someone like that as their queen.
Alexander left a large garrison behind in Afghanistan to protect his new queen and marched towards Pakistan and India. One by one, cities fell. Alexander's constant desire to discover the unknown and his thirst for knowledge drove him on. His old tutor, Aristotle, had led him to believe that from the heights of the Hindu Kush, they would see the waters of the endless ocean, which marked the edge of the world. The army's ascent of these mountains was an extraordinary feat in itself, but intelligence reports told him that another kingdom, not an endless ocean, lay ahead, in lands that as yet were uncharted. His army, however, did not share Alexander's vision. 8 years of endless war, campaigning in some of the most inhospitable terrain in the world, had taken its toll. They wanted to go home.
His intention was to penetrate to the great Indian kingdom of the Nandas around modern Patna and right in the Ganges Valley. And he was going to conquer the area because it had never been under the Persians, and he was expanding the Persian Empire. But of course it was at that point that his men refused to follow him and forced him to turn back, a thing he never forgave them for.
Alexander pleaded with his men not to abandon him in this hour of glory.
Gentlemen of Macedonia, stand firm, for well you know that hardship and danger are the price of glory, and that sweet is a life of courage and of deathless renown beyond the grave.
For once, his words did not inspire them. They simply would not advance any further. Alexander retired to his tent and sulked for 3 days. The army prepared for the road home, which lay back over the tributaries of the river Indus. With an army of this size, troop transportation problems were immense. A fleet of ships was waiting on the coast for some of them, but the rest of the army had to march back overland. A 60-day shortcut through the Gadrosian desert nearly spelled disaster for them. The journey back to the heart of his new empire safely accomplished, Alexander then tried to integrate his men into the Persian world in an effort to control it. In 324 BC, he forced his high-ranking officers into marriages with Persian nobility at a mass wedding ceremony. For Alexander's troops, it was a bridge too far.
He gave them massive wedding gifts and registered the marriages, and all of his companions were married to noble Persians. And it is, I think, telling that none of these marriages survived except one.
Alexander's relationship with his troops had always been inspirational. He made their hardships his own, and always led from the front in any battle. But now, as far as they were concerned, he had gone native and was losing his grip on reality. Worse was to come. In Ecbatana, Babylonia, his beloved Hephaestion died. It was a blow from which Alexander never recovered.
Alexander was utterly devastated by this loss, someone who had been a very close confidant at a time when he probably had very few close friends. He must have been becoming increasingly isolated at that stage. Alexander exhibited grief that was very peculiar. He ordered the manes of all of the cavalry horses to be shorn in mourning as a sign of respect for his great friend.
After the death of Hephaestion, Alexander drowned his sorrows in massive drinking bouts. In Babylon, he fell ill.
We do know that his illness started after a great banquet held by one of his officers, Medeus, at which Alexander drank prodigiously, and then one tradition has him taken ill then and there with a pain in the back, another has him gradually generating a fever. But he had something like 10 days of illness with intensifying fever. He lost his voice and in the end could only acknowledge the Macedonians as they marched past his bedside with gestures.
The greatest conqueror of the ancient world died in his bed, aged 33. The man who believed himself to be divine was mortal after all.
It'd be nice to have a theory of poisoning and a nice conspiracy, but the answer is, I think, we'll never know. The absolutely remarkable thing about Alexander is his military success. I think if one looks at any great military commander of any time, no one can match his record. Napoleon is quite pathetic beside him. To be invincible is something that every commander aspires to be.